took place. People like Rafsanjani and Khamenei simply said that a few people had been killed, but they were Mujahideen combatants who were involved in the military attack on Iran. Abdullah al-Nouri, who would later become the darling of the reform movement and a close associate of President Khatami, and who was the interior minister in the 1980s, spoke to the UN and said that a campaign has been organized abroad alleging that invaders captured on the battlefield had been executed en masse, but he went on to simply deny that this had ever occurred. So as I mentioned at the outset, after having told this story, I just want to talk a little bit about the massacre in the framework of international criminal law. Without delving too deeply into technical discussions, I want to point out that the 1988 massacre is almost a textbook definition of crimes against humanity. The concept of crimes against humanity is now firmly established in customary international law. It has a rich jurisprudence that began roughly in the early 20th century and continued through the Nuremberg trials, and was really developed by the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia and the International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. And now the new Rome Statute of the International Criminal Court draws from that jurisprudence and adds to it. Just a word about the elements of crimes against humanity and why I refer to the 1988 case as a textbook case. A crime against humanity needs to be part of a widespread or systematic attack against civilians. This element is intended to distinguish a crime against humanity from a random attack that's not part of a plan or a policy. Widespread means an attack that's massive, frequent, large scale. And a systematic attack, on the other hand, is more qualitative. It points to the organized nature of the act and of the act of violence and the improbability of its random occurrence. The 1988 killings were almost certainly widespread. They were geographically dispersed across the country, and the number of victims is in the thousands, though the exact magnitude is open to debate. And the killings were certainly systematic, and I'll get to that in just a moment. I also want to point out that the attacks were against civilians. The Iranian government has exerted a great deal of effort in trying to link the victims of that massacre to the Mujahideen's military action in 1988. That position is both factually and legally indefensible. Factually, because the prisoners who had been in prison for many years had nothing to do with the attacks. They were far from the battlefield, they were in no position to take part in spying or terrorist activities, and in the case of prisoners not affiliated with the Mujahideen, the prisoners who were affiliated with various left-wing parties, they didn't even belong to a political party that was involved in the battle. The assertion is also legally incorrect because the customary international law is increasingly showing that any person who has laid down his arms is considered a civilian for the purpose of the definition of crimes against humanity. So even assuming that some of these folks were actually captured on the battlefield, they could not have been summarily executed legally. The other important element of a crime against humanity is that it be part of a preconceived policy. There is some debate about the exact contours of this element, but in the 1988 case, it's crystal clear. In establishing that the 1988 murders were part of a preconceived policy, one needs to refer to the memoirs of Ayatollah Montazeri, who has written with incredible clarity on the topic. And for anyone in the room who doesn't know who Ayatollah Montazeri is, he was actually sort of second in command during the time that Khomeini was alive. He was widely expected to be the person that follows Khomeini. But once he spoke out about this massacre and various other issues, he lost that position and subsequently has been placed under house arrest. I mean, to this day, he remains under de facto house arrest. Anyways, in his memoirs, he has indicated that the orders came from the very top, Khomeini himself, and that many in the upper echelons of the government, like Mousavi Adebili, Ahmad Khomeini, and others, were involved. Who then is responsible for these crimes against humanity? I posit that we have 4 categories of culprits to think about when analyzing these executions. The first group, obviously, is the executioners. The murderers who performed the unlawful act obviously bear criminal responsibility for it. Next in the hierarchy are those who directly ordered or prompted the executions, and this category includes the judges on the death commission or the prison wardens who instigated the killings. Now, thanks to Montazeri's memoirs, some of these figures are fairly well known to us. Nayeri, Ishrawi, Pur Mohammadi, Ibrahim Raisi, others. At the top of this criminal hierarchy are those who participated in the planning of the crime, Montazeri is purposely vague on who these people are. He says that some people came to Khomeini and asked for a letter to execute these political prisoners, but he never really reveals who these people are. But one need only really look at Khomeini's inner circle at that time to figure out who they were. There is a fourth group who bears criminal responsibility for these crimes, and they may sometimes slip one's mind, and it's important that we not forget them. These are government officials who didn't actually order killings or conceive of the policy, but bear criminal responsibility under the doctrine of superior responsibility. These are individuals who had effective command control authority over the perpetrators, who knew or had information that would allow them to know that crimes were being committed and failed to take action. So this actually allows us to look up the chain of command at people who may not have directly sat on the Death Commission, but who must surely have known of its existence and its gruesome activities. So we look to see who headed the intelligence ministry at the time, and we find Mohammad Reshahri. We find Mustabi Ardebili as the chief justice of Iran's courts. We find Ismail Shushtari as head of Iran's prisons. We find Musavi Khomeini, who also later reinvented himself as a reformist, acting as Iran's prosecutor general. And we find Khamenei, the current supreme leader, acting as Iran's president at the time. In the Iranian context, though, I should mention, this doctrine of superior responsibility is a bit problematic. Iran has a particularly chaotic power structure, as some of you know, and it's not always entirely clear who has effective command and control over others. So, having addressed all this, I also want to just talk briefly about what it is we should be doing and what political and legal challenges lie ahead. When thinking about the political challenges involved in the pursuit for accountability in the 1988 case, and when thinking about why no one has seriously taken up an investigation of the case, there is an uncomfortable truth to which many in the human rights community will not admit. But it's the giant elephant in the room, so it doesn't make sense not to address it. I think a primary political problem in addressing the issue is that the majority of victims of the massacre belong to a political group that is now looked upon unfavorably by a lot of human rights organizations and by a great many opinion makers. I don't want to delve into a discussion of the arguments for and against the Mujahideen, but looking at this project of obtaining justice, I think one would immediately recognize that the victims are not viewed in the most sympathetic light. And those who want to keep the story buried will constantly point to that fact. They will point to the fact that the organization is labeled as a terrorist organization in various countries. They will point to the fact that human rights groups have criticized this organization for its own human rights actions, for its cult behavior, so on. I don't want to get into the merits of that argument, but we all know that it has salience. And we all know that the unpopularity of victims has something to do with the fact that the world has been silent about this for so long. A second political or strategic problem is that many of the facts of the case are simply shrouded in mystery. It's so difficult to provide a complete narrative of the crimes of that summer when one doesn't even know how many people were killed or who exactly ordered their killing. The story of 1988 is an incredible story, but it's an incredible story with significant gaps in it. A third political problem has to do with the fact that the world's attention at the moment is not focused on human rights. Rather, the attention is almost exclusively on the nuclear issue, on Iran's sponsorship of insurgents in Iraq, and so on. It's hard to get the world to care about a crime that happened virtually in secret that no one's talked about for 20 years. There is a corollary problem here, and it's a problem that's really arisen in the past 8 years or so, I would say, and that's the fact that the wrong people seem to talk about human rights in Iran. There seems to be a real fear in the human rights community, and some of it is warranted, some of it I don't think it is, that to engage with human rights issues, to talk about the 1988 case or similar cases, is to give neoconservatives, especially in the US, ammunition with which they can attack Iran. On the legal front, too, there's no shortage of problems. You know, for those of us who care about international human rights, who care about international legal mechanisms, the last few weeks have been very good weeks. We've seen the chief prosecutor of the International Criminal Court seeking indictments of Sudan's president. We've seen Radovan Karadzic being caught and handed over to the ICTY at The Hague. But in the Iran case, it's not immediately obvious what institution can actually be really called upon to try anyone accused of these crimes. The Iranian courts are obviously not part of the solution. They are, in fact, very much part of the problem. They are complicit in much of the repression of the Iranian government against Iranian citizens. The International Criminal Court lacks jurisdiction to try the case, both temporal jurisdiction and also territorial jurisdiction. There is no special UN court like the court for Yugoslavia or the court for Rwanda, and national courts of other countries are often very reluctant to use notions of universal jurisdiction to try people for crimes that don't have any link to their country. And even if there was a court, we don't have adequate evidence, we don't have defendants to try. We still don't know how many people were killed, as I pointed out. We still don't know who orchestrated their killing. We don't know who has effective command in the Iranian power structure. So all of this talk of obstacles may lead activists like you and lawyers like me and former prisoners and people interested in justice and others to despair. But I don't think that's what's called for. If anything, all the problems I listed should propel us to act. And when I say we need to act, I mean that we must do more than simply come together every year to commemorate the events. Don't get me wrong, commemorations are important. Observing moments of silence is important. Laying flowers, singing songs, these are all important. But these are only the beginning. What we need now, more than ever, is for a group to come together to actually spearhead a demand for accountability. To combat the problem that I alluded to earlier about the unpopularity of victims, such a group needs to ensure that its campaign for justice is non-political and independent of any partisan leanings. This must not be a campaign to support this or that political group. It must be a movement that stays above partisan frays. It must be a movement that argues that demanding justice and accountability is important for all Iranians, not just those with ties to particular parties. Such a group also needs to publicize what happened in 1988 and let people in the world, particularly policymakers, know about it. What we need to do is shift focus onto the massacre by linking it to what we see in Iran today. You know, we have a government that is utterly unresponsive to its people and their demands, and it's a government that continues to repress, torture, and kill its own people. And it's a government that acts irresponsibly on the international stage. It does all these things because there's an entrenched culture of impunity in Iran. It does these things because the people who carry out horrendous acts, as they did in 1988, walk free. And not only do they walk free, they get promoted and they become government ministers. The government does these things because it has so far been accountable to no one. So it's important that we draw the link between that culture of impunity in Iran and the Iranian government's current appalling behavior at home and abroad. Such a group also needs to begin the tough task of gathering evidence. You know, there are human rights documentation centers that do this kind of work. The speaker after me was actually the founders of one such organization. You know, there are organizations like this here in Europe, they're in North America. Unfortunately, the groups don't communicate very well. And as a result, they don't proceed very efficiently. So a group that focuses on the 1988 massacre needs to partner with them and gather evidence before it's been lost. It needs to gather testimony before memories have faded and people have died. And finally, such a group needs to create alliances with other communities who have been in similar situations. I always mention the Chileans and the people of Argentina as examples. Communities that saw military leaders wreak havoc on their country. But the human rights activists in those countries continue to work tirelessly, bravely and creatively, and have had some notable successes. So, ladies and gentlemen, I sometimes despair about the prospects for success. But then I see Radovan Karadzic in the defendant's box. I see Charles Taylor being tried. I remember Slobodan Milosevic being tried. I remember that Augusto Pinochet's last days were spent in fear of prosecution. I remember that each of these people was thought invincible at the time, but was eventually brought to justice. And when I remember that, I feel encouraged again. A campaign for accountability in the 1988 case requires a serious and sustained effort. It needs people from all walks of life. As I said at the outset, 20 years from now, I hope that we can say that we struggled and eventually won victories in the cause of justice and accountability. I hope that we don't gather to lament our failure to act. I thank you.
Thank you very much for a very detailed and extensive discussion on the matter. I am sure that there will be maybe some questions, but